All right, so just for those of us who need it, here's a little bit of a catch-up of where we are. This is our fourth sermon from our series on 1 Samuel. And we've been kind of not approaching this book where we're going through chapter by chapter, event after event, although that's probably the best way to read it. It's a really interesting read. It's what we call a historical narrative, right? The Bible's full of many different kinds of genres of writings, and 1 and 2 Samuel specifically are an example of historical narrative. So you're meant to kind of read it one after the other. And if you've ever read the Bible in a year or done some kind of reading plan like that, where you're going to read the whole Old Testament over 6 months or something like that, you know that if you read 1 and 2 Samuel, that bleeds right into 1 and 2 Kings, which then goes into 1 and 2 Chronicles. And I tell you, when you read the Bible that way, it's a grind. It's a lot of historical narrative all smushed together, and you read kind of the same story over and over and over again throughout the entire thing. And even where it's different, say in 1 and 2 Kings, where you start looking at the kings after Solomon, for example, they all also start to bleed a little bit together because all those kings, for the most part, are terrible. Right? There's one or two kings who are better than terrible, but for the most part, they're just something. And so we decided to approach, 1 and 2 Samuel with this idea of looking at the characters and looking about the way that they approach their lives and obedience to God and what we can learn from those lessons as Christians, right? Because who here is a king? Right? Yeah, exactly, right? If someone in your life calls you king, that's very nice. I'm glad for your relationship, but you're not actually a king. Sometimes Eddie calls me queen, which I'm not entirely sure why that's happening. But he does this out of a place of love, I'm sure. But if you were here last week, you would know that I didn't actually finish my sermon on Saul. And if I keep this up, I won't finish this one on David either. So we're actually going to continue on looking at kind of one of Saul's failures, what I'm going to call his third failure, not his last failure. We're actually not going to cover Saul's death today. But by covering his third failure, we're also going to cover kind of what seals his fate, ultimately, right? So that's where we're at. That's where we're going to go. And I'm going to try and fill in as many of the blanks as possible, because this morning, if we were to go through all the texts that all of these events happen in, we'd be here until tomorrow. But for context, Saul, as king, his primary mission, aside from being obedient to God and the seer Samuel's messages from God, his primary mission is to defeat those who are opposed to Israel dwelling in the place that God has set aside for them, right? So Israel is descended from Abraham. God promised that Abraham's people would be a holy, set-apart, special people, that God would be with them, and he would preserve them so that they could remain and become a people of God that outnumber the sand on the seashore. Right? And so Saul was given this mission. You got to take out the Philistines and you got to take out the Amalekites. And the Amalekites specifically are interesting because when Israel first fled Egypt, the first people to attack them were the Amalekites, and they attacked them from behind. Right? So Israel's a small tribe of people. They have left Egypt, and they are attacked from the rear by the Amalekites. And ever after that point, God's like, look, these people are not in my good graces, right? These are bad people, and so we need to take care of them. And so that's one of Saul's parameters for his kingly duties. And what's important to note, we're not going to cover this text, but at the beginning of the chapter in which we find our text, specifically, Saul is told to completely destroy the Amalekites, right? Don't take any of their stuff. Just get rid of them. They are anathema. They are not holy. They are evil. Destroy everything. Do not take any plunder from the Amalekites, right? Like, this was very strongly told to Saul. Do not take anything. Destroy them. Leave them destroyed as unholy things and get out of there. Saul doesn't do that. Saul wipes the people out. He has no problem with that part of it. But to leave the treasures behind and the goats behind, he's like, no, I'm not doing that. That's a good goat. Really? So verse 12 of 1 Samuel 15, pardon me, I forgot something important. Forgive me, Jesus. All right. I'm lucky I can get out the front door with having my fly up, let alone remembering all this stuff. Is anyone else like me? No? Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, church. So verse 12 of 1 Samuel 15. Early the next morning, Samuel got up early to meet Saul the next morning. So again, Samuel is a prophet from God. He was a judge, the last of the judges. He is the direct line to Yahweh, to God, right? So that's who Samuel is. But Samuel was informed Saul, the king, has gone to Carmel, where he is setting up a monument for himself. So just as a little footnote for you, does anyone, like when you read Carmel, and don't think of the candy, but when you read Carmel, do any, Bible school, Sunday school bells ring in your mind? Anyone? You're smiling. No, not me. So this is a place that routinely shows up in the scriptures. It's kind of what we'd call a high place. Yeah, that's right. It's a high place, and it's a place that shows up in the Bible where people do both good and bad things at the top of, because high places are kind of treated as accessed closer to God, right? So in this period of time, their cosmology, their understanding how the universe works and all this, and divinity works, is God dwelled in the firmament or above the firmament, right? So they look up at the stars, and they would perceive the stars to be angels, right? Divine beings. And above them all, and the sun and the moon were actually perceived in this point in time, in this culture, as also being divine beings, right? And God was above these things. So theoretically then, the closer you could get to stars and the sun and the firmament and all this sort of stuff, the closer you get to God, right? So you'd go to the high place, and over time, different cultures would come into Israel, and idolatry would happen on a lot of these mountains, and they would build all sorts of monuments and Asherah poles and poles to Baal and all this sort of stuff. Right? So when you see a character going up to a high place in the scripture and they don't immediately turn themselves over to Yahweh in doing so, they're doing bad things. So old Saul here is going up to a high place and creating a monument to what? Himself. Right? So that's not a red flag that immediately will catch us in the text. I mean, aside from the fact that, dude, you're building a statue for yourself. But the extra element of it being in a high place is really fascinating, but we'll keep going. Then Saul left and went down to Gilgal, the bottom there. When Samuel came to Saul, Saul said to him, "May the Lord bless you. I have fulfilled the Lord's orders." Spoken like a man who just built a statue to himself. I did it, boss. You can tell God. I nailed it. Amalekites, gone. Big deal. Samuel replied, "If that is the case, then what is the sound of sheep in my ears and the sound of cattle that I hear?" It's one of those golden nuggets of humor in the scriptures, right? It's just like, oh, you destroyed all the goats. Yep, certainly. Like, just moo. Yeah, not a cow in sight, Samuel. I did it. Saul then said in response to this incredulous response, they were brought from the Amalekites. The army spared the best of the flocks and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord our God, but everything else was slaughtered. Isn't this great? Right? Like, Luna, why did you hit Ben? Well, he was going to get up on the couch, and that's bad. Yeah, but you don't hit Ben. Right? Here's the thing you're supposed to do. Destroy all of it. It's all unholy. It's like, no, these are really good cows. Like, Samuel, come here. Have you seen? This is a good cow. God would love this cow. He's trying to paint a golden sheen on his mess here. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Wait a minute. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night." And Saul said to him, "Tell me." It's going to be good news. Samuel said, "Is it not true that when you were insignificant in your own eyes, you became head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord chose you as a king over Israel." Right? Remember this last week. Saul, farmer kid, he was good looking, sure, but he was from Benjamin, small tribe, not a big deal. Backwaters farmer kid was picked to be king of Israel. Don't you remember that, Saul? The Lord sent you on a campaign saying, "Go and exterminate, those sinful Amalekites. Fight against them until you have destroyed them." Why haven't you obeyed the Lord? Instead, you have greedily rushed upon the plunder. You have done what is wrong in the Lord's estimation. Then Saul said to Samuel, but I have obeyed the Lord. I went on the campaign the Lord sent me on. I brought back King Agag of the Amalekites after exterminating the Amalekites. Oh, by the way, Samuel, not only did I take the sheep and the goats and some of that gold that looked pretty nice, here's the king. Is that missing? Exterminate all the Amalekites. Here's the king. Look. Not only did he take all the gold, he's got the king with him of the people he was supposed to take all out. Hey, Sam, have you met Agag? Swell guy, really good foosball player. Yeah, he's an Amalekite, but don't pay attention to that. But the army took from the plunder some of the sheep and cattle. The best of it was to be slaughtered to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. Then Samuel said, "Does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as he does in obedience?" This is Samuel saying, God wanted you to follow what he said, not appear really religious. Which, that's not my point, but there's a little message for us in there. If you're an aggressive driver on the streets of Calgary and you're cutting people off and flipping them in the bird, but you got like a nice Jesus sticker on the back of your van, it doesn't cancel the other one out. You're still doing wrong out there. And I say that as a very aggressive driver. A friend of mine used to say that I'm being sanctified, but the last part of my body that will be sanctified will be my right foot, because that's the gas and brake foot. That resonated with me. I struggle. This is why if we ever do a missions trip, I'm not driving the van. But Samuel's getting on something really important here. The Lord wants obedience, not religious show for its own sake. Right? Disobeying God and being like, but I did it for you. I disobeyed you for you. What is that? What is that? That's not helpful. Certainly, obedience is better than sacrifice. Paying attention is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination or witchcraft or prophecy, whatever you want to call it. And presumption is like the evil of idolatry. Presuming you know God's will is like idolatry. Because you have rejected the Lord's orders, he has rejected you from being king. The Lord has rejected Saul from being king. Third strike deadly. Saul tries to make it better. Then Saul said to Samuel, "I have sinned, for I have disobeyed what the Lord commanded, and your words as well. For I was afraid of the army, and I obeyed their voice." Now he's blaming his subordinates. "Now please forgive my sin. Go back with me so I can worship the Lord." And Samuel said to Saul, "I will not go back with you, for you have rejected the Lord's orders, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel." Game over, Saul. You're fired. His life isn't lost in this moment, but he is set on the path where it will be. Not only will he die, but his choices will actually result in the deaths of others, including his son Jonathan, because of disobedience. And so thematically, after talking about last week, Saul chooses his independence, to make his own decisions, to choose to override God's authority so that he could be wealthy, so that he could gloat over a shamed king, and he lost his God. He is abandoned to his own fate. So the lesson for us is that independence from God can cost us at our deepest level. What's the application? What's the takeaway for that? Honestly, church, it's to be wary of the temptation that reigns in our lives. When you struggle with a consistent temptation in your life, and oftentimes when we fail and we choose to give in to that temptation, it often comes from this weird sort of place where you have justified to yourself that what you're about to do is okay. Right? It's like the alcoholic saying, it's just one beer, right? It's like the porn addict saying, it's just one picture, or it's just one whatever. This stuff has ensnared you for a reason, and when you choose to satisfy yourself and you choose to fight these battles on your own without God, it will cost you. In James chapter 1, it says, "But each one is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires." Saul was enticed by his own desires to be wealthy, to be the victorious king, to gloat, so that when his desire conceives as his image of childbirth, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is full grown, it gives birth to death. We see this in Saul's life. His temptation costs him the throne, costs him his glory, costs him his life and the life of his son. And the next king, who we're about to meet in a moment, is not related to Saul in any way. We don't know what really goes on with, well, we know a little bit about what goes on with his family after this, but it's not glorious, it's not amazing. They are in trouble. And so to contrast this, today, for the rest of our sermon, we're going to be focusing mostly on David. And this will be part one of David, because part two, when we get to it in January, will show us how far that David will fall as well. But the David we're meeting today, the David we're going to interact with today, is presented by the scriptures as a good example. So let's meet him. So I'm not going to go through all of it, but just for a little bit here, David was the youngest of his brothers. He was a shepherd. So again, God seems to like making kings out of simple people. People have simple professions, rather. He's from Bethlehem, which we're right around the corner from Christmas, so that's going to come up again. We won't talk about that too much now. But Bethlehem, suffice it to say, was very rural, quite a small place, but consistently comes through Scripture as something that's important. He was a musician who wrote about half the book of Psalms was written by David while he was king. And of course, as we all know, he killed Goliath, right? Stones and what do they call that? The slingshot. But at verse 7, the Lord said to Samuel, so what's happening here contextually is that one after the other, Jesse, David's dad, brings his sons to Saul. Saul's like, hey, bring your sons. One of them is meant to be anointed to be king. And so, as was the tradition, Jesse brings his oldest, strongest, most, excellent boy. And Samuel's like, no, not him. And then they kind of go through all of Jesse's sons. And when they get to the last one, it says in verse 7, but the Lord said to Samuel, don't be impressed by his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. Or second to last, God does not view things the way people do. People look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. The Lord looks at the heart. So Jesse had him brought in. This is now David. We're jumping down to verse 12. And David, he was ruddy, which means he looked like a little red in the face, with attractive eyes and a handsome appearance, right? So part of you will be like, uh-oh, it's going to happen again. Saul was picked because he was good looking and tall. Are we about to make the same mistake, really? But remember, God looks at the heart. So the Lord said, go and anoint David. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn full of olive oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day onward. So this is fascinating. We had also in Saul, if you can remember, moments where the Spirit of the Lord would be upon him. But it was clear almost immediately that the Spirit was not meant to linger on Saul. I don't think you should argue, based on what David goes on to do, that the Spirit dwelled within him permanently. But there is this element that because of David's heart and his closeness to God, the Spirit remains on David to an extent that it did not on Saul. So then Samuel got up and went to Ramah. So it's interesting that, like with Saul, he's anointed king, and then he just kind of goes about his business. Right? But what's important for us to kind of take from this is that God desires your heart, right? So if there's one person in this world you cannot deceive, it is God. You can deceive your friends. Even if you don't mean to lie to them, you can present yourself in a way that's not true to who you are. You can lie to your bosses or in job interviews. You can lie to your spouse or your partner. But there's only one person outside of yourself, and I would say even sometimes we get ourselves wrong, but there's only one person outside of ourselves that truly knows us, and it's God. You can't lie to God. You can't come to church and think that ticks the faith box. In the Gospels, Jesus has some harsh words for people who call on his name, but who do not know him. Depart from me, I do not know you. And that's going to happen to people who have lived their whole lives in church. And I don't want to scare you or discourage you, but I want to drive home the reality that, like Saul's religion with his sacrifices wasn't adequate, but obedience was, God wants your heart. He wants you to be obedient to him. And not just because he's dad and, he's mean and you got to do what he says. Because his heart for you is one of love and compassion and calling. So are you going to be like David today, or are you going to be like Saul? Are you going to show up at church and you're going to do the religion thing and be like, God, I did it. I did the religion thing. I feel better about myself. Or are you going to do the obedience thing? Are you going to do the heart thing today? I can't decide for you. But I want to ask you that question. So let's learn more about David. So we're now in chapter 16, jumping down to 14. Now the Spirit of the Lord had turned away from Saul. So remember, even though he's cursed, even though he's in trouble, even though he is no longer the king that God intends him to be, he's still allowed to reign for a little bit longer. And an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him, which, by the way, for a lot of us, this passage is like, what does this mean? And guess what? We're not talking about it today. But suffice it to say, if you want to talk to me about it, send me a text, shoot me an email. We can talk about this. We can wrestle and figure this out. But if I started talking about this passage, we won't stop. But suffice it to say, Saul has been abandoned by God, and he has been tormented by an evil spirit. So then Saul's servant said to him, look, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord instruct his servants who are here before you to look for a man who knows how to play the lyre. It's like a harp. Then whenever the evil spirit from God comes upon you, he can play the lyre and you will feel better. Right? You can do hot yoga and meditate, and you'll feel better. So Saul said to his servants, find me a man who plays well and bring him to me. One of his attendants replied, I have seen a son of Jesse in Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He is a brave warrior and is articulate and handsome, for the Lord is with him. And we know that this is David. Thank you. Yeah, that's right. So Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is out with the sheep." So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a container of wine, and a young goat, and sent them to Saul with his son David. And by the way, after this story, Goliath shows up, and then eventually he's slain by David, and David just kind of goes on this streak of just winning, man. But there's this beautiful detail to the story here. Like, Dad is sending him off to be king. So he packs the bread, the wine, a young goat, if necessary. And so then David came to Saul and stood before him, and Saul liked him a great deal, and he became his armor bearer, like immediate promotion. Right? Armor bearer is like one of the most highly decorated kind of positions in the whole kingdom. And by the way, the Bible does not tell us how old David is at this point. He's the youngest of his brothers. The scriptures describe him as being young, as being full of energy, so like 16, 17, maybe younger, maybe a little bit older. And then Saul sent word to Jesse saying, "Let David be my servant, for I am very pleased with him." So whenever the Spirit from God would come upon Saul, David would take his lyre and play it. And this would bring relief to Saul and make him feel better. And then the evil spirit would leave him alone. So again, we want to focus on David. What is this story telling us about David? Well, we know that God knows his heart. And his heart has stood out to God as something valuable. So what is David doing? He knows, I'm not sure if Saul knows. Saul knows he's no longer king, but he probably doesn't know who's got the job. And so this little shepherd boy shows up in the most powerful man's house, the king. He knows that he's next in line. He's his armor bearer. And yet he serves Saul. He doesn't connive to take him out. He doesn't threaten Saul. He bears his armor and he plays music for him that soothes his soul. So what does this tell us about God's heart? Right? God knew David's heart. David is described in the scriptures, even after he fails, as a man after God's own heart. It tells us that God's heart is for the servants. Right? What kind of man, or boy, if you will, is David? On his own, he travels to play music, to serve the king, to bear his armor, knowing the whole time, I'm next. And we won't cover this today, but eventually, we'll get there in a moment, actually. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But God's heart is reflected in David's service of the king. And I don't mean just like this. If you don't get this twisted, I'm not about to tell you to join the coffee team, even though that's great. I'm not about to tell you that we need more kids volunteers, which is also true. I'm not about to tell you all this sort of stuff, even though I am. But when I say service and a servanthood, I mean a whole lifestyle, an orientation towards serving others, serving your neighbor, serving even your enemies. And we'll see what sort of service David continues to provide. In Mark chapter 10, it says, "But it is not this way among you." This is Jesus talking. "Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first among you must be slave of all." There's a band I really like called Fit for a King. And they're a Christian metal band. And they're super heavy and awesome, and I like them a lot. They have a song called "Slave to Nothing." And I like that band a lot, but scripturally, they're wrong on two counts. One, the Bible talks about us being slaves to the Lord. And two, Jesus is telling us that if we wish to be great, we need to be a slave to all. But slave to everything doesn't sound as metal, so. Verse 45 says, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Remember, Christ did this, right? Christ is who? God. Good. I got a job for you, Eddie. There's no error here. I want to say this over and over again. Be a servant. Like David, like Jesus. Don't grab, don't become wealthy just for yourself. If you are wealthy, God be upon you, that's blessing. How are you serving? If you have no money, God bless you, how are you serving? Are you a student? How are you serving? Are you retired? How are you serving? God's heart is for the servants. We're going to read a little bit about victorious Saul, and we'll be almost finished. On every mission, this is now in chapter 18, so we're skipping over Goliath today. On every mission on which Saul sent him, David achieved success. So Saul appointed him over the man of war. Boom, another promotion. This pleased not only all the army, but also Saul's servants. Continuing on with verse 6. When the men arrived after David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women from all the cities of Israel came out singing and dancing to meet King Saul. They were happy as they played their tambourines and three-stringed instruments. The women who were all playing the music sang, "Saul has struck down his thousands, but David his tens of thousands." So in this moment, you're one of two people. You're either, yeah, David, you're a man after God's heart. You're way better than Saul. Or you're on Saul's side right now. Do you feeling him, where you're like, ooh. Like King Saul, hey, what are they saying? This is my parade. This made Saul, understandably, very angry. The statement displeased him, and he thought, they have attributed to David tens of thousands, but to me they have attributed only thousands. What does he lack except the kingdom? There's that dramatic irony again. We know something you don't. So Saul was keeping an eye on David from that day onward. Verse 10, the next day an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he prophesied within his house. Isn't that interesting? Prophesying from an evil spirit. It's not the first time either. A little bit later, Saul is going to interact with a witch. And they're going to try and bring Samuel back from the dead. And it works. That's the crazy part. It works. But what are the fruits? Now, David was playing the lyre as usual, probably like side-eyeing Saul. Like, what's happening here? And there was a spear in Saul's hand, and Saul threw the spear thinking, I'll nail David to the wall. But David escaped from him on 2 different occasions. I want to pause here for a moment. I once read this book that argued that we can learn a lesson about the sort of pain that comes from leaders who hurt us from a passage like this. There is David serving Saul as best as he can. He can't control what these people sing. He was his armor bearer. He played music to soothe his heart. And in a moment of evil and sinfulness, as a leader, he lashes out and tries to murder this servant. I don't want to push this too hard and exegete this out of context, but I do think there is an argument, and I think there should be some comfort for us, even in the midst of reading this, that even someone like David was not spared the pain of a hurtful leader. I think each one of us, as we have lived our lives, younger or advanced, has experienced the pain of being hurt by someone we trust or respect or long to please. And just like David here, I want to remind you of one thing. It's not your fault. If a leader has hurt you because they were distracted or flippant or just wrong, it's not your fault. If a pastor has spoken into your life in a way that has hurt you and pulled you from God, not motivated you to be closer to God, it's not your fault. It doesn't mean you deserved it. It doesn't mean you were wrong. They were wrong. And as your pastor, as your leader, I pray that I never hurt you this way. But if I do, remember, it's not your fault. And I, in my sinfulness, do not reflect Christ's love for you. On my good days, I hope so. On my days where I make jokes that maybe hurt you, I'm sorry. It's not your fault. And that goes for me or someone else in your life who has maybe done more harm than that. But as we think about Saul specifically, we're reminded that envy is violence. And envy is going to be different for us than it was for Saul in that moment. No one's threatening to take your house or your job, I think. But yet, envy in 2020, what year? 4? Envy is actually one of, I think, the most pervasive challenges we have in our lives because we're so surrounded and intimate with people's lives around us in a way that we never were before. Right? Like, I on the side, I make money as a musician, right? It's something I like to do for fun. And so I have like a social media page so that when I get gigs or I'm inquiring about gigs, I can send them to my social media and be like, hey, here's me playing guitar. Pretty good, right? You should hire me. People will look at my videos and be like, wow, Rob's really good at guitar. What they don't realize is like the clip I put on there that's 15 seconds long is like takes 75. And I've like biffed it over and over again, right? But I throw the one that's good on social media because it looks good on me and it impresses people and great, right? The same goes if you interact with like fitness influencers, right? Like you understand that every picture you see of a fitness person on the internet, they're flexing so hard. And in a lot of cases, they're probably also dehydrated. And if you want to flex all day and be dehydrated, more power to you, I guess. But they're presenting something that's fictional, right? Or at least hyper-realized. But yet it can cause in us an envy. It can actually reinforce the idols in our lives when we see these things around us. And that can cause us to do violence not to our own spirits, our own hearts, our own desires, but those around us. If I spend if I just work a little bit harder, longer hours, I'll get that promotion, I'll get what they have, I get what I deserve, and then yet while you're doing this, you're doing violence to your family, you're doing pain to your family because you've neglected them for your career. You've neglected them for the gym. You've neglected them for the passions and hobbies and desires you have on your own heart. The same spirit that causes Saul to throw a spear at his closest servant is the same spirit that reigns within us when we get tempted by social media, when we get tempted by lifestyle influencers that are not of God. I'm not saying that because everyone on social media is a liar or bad. Like, I'm sure there's lots of great people out there, and I have people that I follow, and so do you, and that's great. But be cautious around these things, for envy creates idols quicker than you might realize. So rather, depend on God like David did. Even in the midst of spears, even as he flees into the wilderness and spends literal years on the run from Saul, because the spears are just the beginning, church. As he flees away, David depends on God when he lives in a cave. He depends on God when his king almost slaughters him. He depends on God when his best friend Jonathan is killed because of the actions of his father, Saul. I want to invite the other half of the worship team up. I've taken Saul and I've taken David here to combine into one sort of story that teaches us about independence. Independence is not a fruit of the Spirit, church. It's not. But love is, peace is, and patience is. So whether this morning you're in a place of healing from leaders who have hurt you, whether this morning you're in a place where you recognize that envy is rife in your life, or whether whether this morning you're begging God to give you the heart of a servant so that you can serve him in obedience and faithfulness, the call is the same. You can start now. We're going to pass the plates here in a moment, and if you give, great. If you're not prepared to give, do not give or feel ever compelled to give. But if you're called by God to give this morning out of obedience, then do that. But as we give financially, as we give through the ways that we sing and rejoice and focus on the cross this morning, remain in a place of dependence. For out of dependence on God can come good fruit from all these things. Let's pray. Dear Lord, you are good, and we depend on you this morning. You are good, and we want more of that goodness in our lives. God, we struggle to know the truth sometimes because we get in our own way. So this morning, God, make less of us and more of you reign in our hearts and our decisions. As we prepare our hearts to give financially to the mission of this church, may you make us glad givers. And if this morning we cannot spare financially, help us to give gladly of our hearts and spirits. There are those of us in this room that are in challenging relationships with our neighbors, and it's because of our own pride. Break away that pride and help us to be like you, Jesus, who did not believe equality with you, Father, was something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking on the form of a servant. God, you are good, and we are so grateful for what you've given us. And if this morning we're in a place of struggle and hardship, may you take that burden off our hearts in these moments and remind us of your goodness. Amen.